the final deciding factor on whether to, keep the guest room lower than the rest of the house is the kind of guests you have. Do you want them to be comfortable, or do you want them to move along,
Leave
in a day or
quickly.
two because they're freezing? Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Mike Gurdon, Editorial Advisor for Fine Homebuilding.
Howdy.
Ian Schwant, Contributing Editor and Production Manager for TDS Custom Construction.
Hello, everyone. Appearing from Patrick's garage.
And our producer and man about town, Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
So you spoiled the surprise. Wait, I'm not even done with the intro. You just completely threw me off here. Please email your questions at fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Whew, I think my feet fell out from under me. Anyway, what is that beautiful space you're calling us from, Ian?
Yeah, it's this gorgeous space. I'm sitting in front of a staircase that somebody built and changed around. Yeah, it's the other room in Patrick's garage.
Yeah, so the barn has a living space. The lean-to part where I'm in is connected to the space that's Ian in, and oddly, we're separated by a closed door because the crosstalk on the microphones would be a problem for recording. But it's great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm psyched to be here. It's been great being back in the Northeast.
Just in time for our first significant snowfall of the winter in southern New England.
That's right.
I think we got 5-6 inches here.
Yeah.
What'd that do for your drive? You were coming from the Poughkeepsie area?
Yeah, it wasn't that bad. You didn't make me get here too early today, so I had plenty of time to let roads get clear first.
What are you doing on your visit, Ian?
So my wife works for a company that is headquartered in Long Island City, and she had a 2-day conference yesterday and today. So we decided to come out a couple days early, see some people that we never got to say a proper goodbye to when we left the Northeast. And I threw it out to Patrick about maybe meeting up with him, and we stopped at John Beer's house that he is building as part of the Fine Homebuilding House 2023 online features, and did a live show from there. And I think we're going to talk more about that program in general in the after show, right, Patrick? Yeah.
In the last 2 days, we've had 3 conversations with 3 builders, or will have had conversations with 3 builders of Fine Homebuilding homes. And I think it's interesting conversation. We were talking to John about how the dual mission of the program is to elevate residential construction and show some best practices for builders in a real environment with all the challenges. How would you describe John's building site, Ian, as one challenge example?
Well, he's got a lot of challenges. It's not often that first you have to build a bridge to get to your job site, but he did have to hire an engineer and build a new bridge. And it's a pretty cool bridge. On the way out, I actually kind of crawled underneath it and took a look at it. It's a really neat structure. And then the house itself is would you call it a post-war kind of GI build ranch house? And he's adding
very
partial,
typical brick ranch. I think it was 1,100 square feet, he told us, right? Yeah, so.
Yeah, and he's adding a partial
normal.
Second story and an addition off the rear of the house.
It's a cool project.
Yep.
What have you been up to, Mike?
Oh, yesterday I went down to a local landscape supply place and picked up some flagstone. Well, they call it flagstone. It's sandstone. I think of flagstone as being slate up in
or
New
bluestone here, right?
Or bluestone, yeah. So this is big slabs of sandstone, and I wasn't quite expecting the size that they were. They're like 3 feet by 4 feet and about 2 inches thick.
Holy
And
crap.
And you
fortunately,
picked them
they
up?
yeah, well, no, I lowered them down off my truck. Fortunately, we were planning because the way it's set up, in a big yard like that, if you're going to take a whole pallet, they'll fork it, drop it on your truck. But if you're just going to get like 6, 7, 8 slabs like we were planning, usually they just let you struggle your way through it, cart them over with a dolly to the scale, put them on the scale, weigh them because they sell them by the pound, and then hoist them up on your truck. And of course, I've got a heavy duty pickup, so it's about 3.5 or 4 feet just to the tailgate. And anyway, one of the guys there said, "Hey, I can swap, put the forks on, the loader, and I'll give you a hand." See, he wasn't busy, so whew, good thing. So yeah, I got
It
like
sounds like you have a compact utility tractor in your future, Mike. Am I right?
I'm always on different aftermarket sales sites looking for a small backhoe loader with a fork. But prices are just so high, even for used on that equipment right now. But someday, maybe.
Jeff, have you ever fantasized about having a little tractor?
All the time. All the time.
Do you have projects going on around the house?
It's been pretty quiet. I actually took a page out of your book and made a little brush attachment for my reciprocating saw to clean tile and grout.
Very cool. Well, I was reminded of the frailty of the human body last week when I slipped on the slippery steps traveling from my barn to the house, and hyperextended my arm by falling backward and landing all my weight on my right shoulder. And so I'm kind of infirmed right now, but I'm getting better, and just want to remind you all, take your time walking around. Be careful, especially in the winter, because you can really hurt your working life. I'm pretty lucky. I get to do a mix of things, but if I had to be a carpenter this past week, I would be out of luck and off work. So, boy, be careful out there.
Taunton cannot afford for you to go down, Patrick.
Well, I was feeling pretty sorry for myself on Friday morning when I was sitting in the emergency room at the New Milford Hospital. But, I feel like I got off easy because I could have been in surgery that afternoon for hours, or, having my arm set. I didn't break it. I didn't dislocate it. It's some kind of sprain, but, and I'm getting increased mobility back. But boy, it's a damper on your active lifestyle, I got to say, if you're laid up.
I guess that could be a after show someday, is job site injuries and how we deal with them, and whether or not we get back to work right away or whether we take a little time off.
It's
I'm sure we all have war stories.
Yeah, and I mean, like, certain injuries could end your career. Like, how are you a carpenter if you don't have a right shoulder and you're right-handed? I mean, like, what are you going to do? You could supervise, you could train, but you're not swinging a hammer or moving heavy stuff. I guarantee it. Have you guys ever taken a fall enough to end up in the ER?
No, I've been very lucky over my career to never injure myself much more than just really nasty cuts.
It's
Back in the
it's
old
bad.
days of the 1980s and early 90s, we didn't use fall protection. And I was cutting rafter tails, which was, thinking back to what we could do today versus then. We used to put the rafters up. We cut the bird's mouth. We'd set the rafters on the plates, and then we cut the tails for the fascia and the soffit afterwards. Of course, I'm doing that while one arm hung around the rafter and then leaning out over, dancing on the top plate, and it was 2 stories up. And I
Oh
went,
man.
my tool belt, my hammer caught when I moved, so it threw me off balance, and I went down and popped right up. And then a minute later, it was like, oh, this doesn't look so good. So, yeah, it was,
What'd you do?
what, three? what did I do? Um, uh, Basically, luckily, nothing broken. A lot of bruises. Of course, they X-rayed my back because I landed on my head and my shoulder. And when they X-rayed my back, they said, "Well, you broke your back." And I'm like, "Uh-oh." And they said, "But it looks like it was a long time ago and it healed itself." And I'm scratching my head. Okay, when did I break my back and it healed? So,
They could have started with that part, right?
I think the doctor he could tell I had a little sense of humor, so he wasn't like, he wasn't, that usual caged kind of responses they give you. And then it was just a lot of bruising and having my legs up in the air for like a week.
You are so lucky. Yeah,
That
me too.
shook that shook me up, and as well as the whole crew. And shortly after that, Rick Arnold and we had a crew of about 6 or 7 guys. We went all in on OSHA and hard hats, fall protection, everything. It just shocked all of us that, how easy it was. And none of us had been hurt for many years prior to that. So, yeah.
As they say, it only takes a second to really change your life. And boy, we should all be grateful we're even here. This comes from Adam. Hey guys, just listen to the latest podcast and you hit on a few things I actually know something about. I'm an engineer who works in highways as my day job, and cement as in the components in concrete, has been a problem to get a hold of for a few years. There always seems to be issues at cement plants preventing production, but one of our bigger issues is changes in coal power production has reduced the amount of fly ash available for high-performance concrete. This lack of availability means we are using more Portland cement in our concrete, which makes sense, is having an impact to availability for smaller buyers. Yeah, I've heard the same thing, that one of the downsides of reduced coal power production is less fly ash for both insulation products and, as a cement binder in concrete. Have you heard of this happening out in the Southwest, Mike, or similar shortages of concrete?
Shortages, yes, but I wasn't aware of the problem with fly ash, which is, they put in a lot of the mixes, and to give it a little more plasticity, I understand, and it in workability, and it makes perfect sense. As we go more renewables and we're taking more coal plants offline, now all of a sudden there's a secondary impact that you don't often think of. We were taking a waste product, the fly ash, and using it in both, as you say, as in Adam's point, concrete, but also in poly ash and other fly ash building products. It's like, okay, what's going to happen with True Exterior from Westlake? Is that going to, a product that's been on the market for whatever 10 or 15 years, is it going to like disappear now because they can't get the raw materials, fly ash?
And people love it, right? They would be sad. It's got some advantages. Adam says, on the topic of productivity, I suspect part of the reason construction looks less productive than other industries is how automation has made most industries far more productive, but construction tool improvements just don't match what CNC and similar improvements have done in many other industries. I hope this is set to change in the near future. I've seen some interesting machines being deployed in related industries, like automated skid loaders that can position materials, letting workers focus on installation. I hope these advances continue and are able to trickle into home building to help with the labor shortages in our industry. Just some thoughts, Adam. Thanks, Adam. I think that was pretty cool. Have you seen an automatically positioning skid steer loader? I'm thinking that's the maybe utility tractor you need, Mike, to help with your flagstone paving, right?
Yeah, especially if it could just read my mind and be in the right position. Like when I work with my brother, I don't even have to think. I just reach and he already has whatever I need there to hand to me. I don't know if a smart AI controlled skid steer will be able to be that sophisticated.
And I bet it'll cost more than you paid for your first several houses.
Certainly more than you pay your brother.
Come on, that's how we can do bathrooms and kitchens so cheap.
Yeah, $10,000 kitchen, yeah.
This comes from our friend Dack. Hi, FHB guys. Hearing about a listener's $70,000 bid for an 8x10 kitchen got me thinking. A regular DIYer armed with some grit and an FHB all access subscription could do this for around 10% of the bid price, not including appliances. To the stud demo is easy. Sledgehammer and crowbar. Myron's got you covered on drywall, and he includes a link to Myron's project guide. Tiling a backsplash is no big deal. There's a project guide for that. Installing IKEA cabinets. Got that one too. Install the sink. Yep. Countertops also. He wraps up by saying, get a plumber and an electrician to help with anything out of your comfort zone and check your work. Done. Thanks, Dack. I sometimes forget the amazing resources that are on the finehomebuilding.com website because we just take it for granted because it's part of our everyday existence. So thanks for that.
And the FHB website has become so much more usable with those project guides. Years ago, even though I kind of knew there were lots of tile articles, it was like you search tile and you get 15,000 hits on the search bar. But now that it's chunked into, a backsplash or a tile shower or a tile floor or any of those things, it makes it so much easier to zero in on what you want to know when you need to know it.
Yeah, and grouping stuff that way makes so much sense, right? Look at the video, read the article, read the other article, read about new products that may have come along since the article was written, all about it, and it makes a lot of sense.
But also having the task put out in the sequential order that you should do it in. So like Mike's talking about tile work, you can find your waterproofing article that'll tell you how to waterproof the shower. Then you can find a layout article telling you how to lay out tile correctly, how it integrates with your plumbing fixtures, all the different kinds of shower bases that you can put in or tub bases. They'll walk you through the whole process.
And I might point out with some degree of pride that the information is pretty darn good. The rest of the stuff you get on the internet, boy, the reliability of information is pretty hit or miss. This comes from Dan, our first question. Hi, podcast. I know this question comes up over and over again, but are there any good resources, studies, or current best practices that we can look at to learn what the currently understood best way is to retrofit insulation for an existing basement? I have a 1956 house in Zone 5 that was built without things like a capillary break between the foundation and sill plate, likely without any waterproofing treatments on the foundation walls, etc. There is so much conflicting information out there about what to do in those types of situations. Some people advocate for using rigid foam or spray foam to air seal and reduce condensation inside. However, that seems like it would prevent the sill/rim from drying out in the event it gets wet due to moisture wicking up from the foundation. I've seen some videos of people doing this, but the classic method of using bats on a vapor barrier has fallen out of favor since it just causes moisture problems between the barrier and the wall. Would that still hold true using a smart vapor barrier like membrane? With all this conflicting information, how are we supposed to talk to contractors/companies and know whether or not they know what they're talking about or are working with the most up-to-date information we have? Although there's no guarantee of what will happen as a result of changing things like airflow and drying capabilities of a house, the consequences of getting it wrong won't show up for years most likely, so how do we give ourselves the best chance of getting it right? I think it's another plug for FHB, am I right?
Yep.
And it's so much more to do with the best practices for the existing condition that you have. It's a little bit like the last time I was on with Mike and we were talking about the building assemblies in Nova Scotia versus building assemblies in Manitoba and British Columbia. Even though they're the same climate zone, you have so many different externalities that are impacting that decision you've got to make and how best to do your basement. I mean, even the drainage of a site can tell you a lot about what you can get away with and what you can't when you're doing a basement. Are there any best practices you've come up with, Mike, that are really good kind of general points to hit?
Well, I think what you're pointing out is talking about the site conditions and everything is the answer to the question is it depends on your situation. You've got to evaluate how much moisture is getting in from the outside, how it's getting in. As far as practices go, I always start not on the inside of the basement. I start on the outside. Gutters, downspouts, slope grade, and the downspouts connected to pipes that go away from the building as far as possible. And then I have gotten in the regular habit on any house that I purchase to fix up, to rent or sell, and which are usually in that same time period of 1950s and 1960s that that Dan has, and I always put underground gutters. I pull out any of the plants and landscaping that are within 6 feet of the foundation. I dig down about maybe 6 or 8 inches, make sure we got a sloping grade, and then I put an EPDM or other good quality heavy sheet material, like a roofing material, against the foundation, down and away, 3 or 4 feet away, and then I cap that over with some from stone or gravel, and that way you're getting the water away from the foundation. If you've got water problems coming up, I should say water table problems coming up from underneath, that's a different condition. That's where you got water that's down in the water table, the water's rising up and coming either close to or getting into the slab and leaking in. Though that you may have to deal with differently with sump pumps and drains. But once you deal with everything to get the water away from the building, then really the default standard is going to some sort of a foam product on the inside. Be it spray foam or be it rigid foam panels that are taped and sealed and applied to the walls and possibly the floor. Andy Engel did a good article, which we haven't, the magazine has not done another one on finishing a basement since Andy did it, because he covered the whole thing. And
Yeah,
there's nothing
sometimes you can't improve upon something, right?
Yeah. What we should do is just reissue that article in the magazine so that it looks like it's current information. So when a lot of people, when you search the internet, you look for the latest date. Is it 2020? Oh my gosh, it's before 2020. That's old information. But in the case of Andy's article, which I think was probably around 2010, maybe 2012, maybe longer ago, it still stands the test of time.
So true. Any thoughts on what to do with the mud sill in contact with the foundation top? That seems like a tough nut to crack. You're not going to jack up the house to put a capillary break in there. So I think you just got to resist the temptation to cover it with spray foam so it can at least dry as the rising damp comes up through through the foundation walls. Is that off base? Am I giving bad advice?
No, I think you've got to accept the limitations of your existing condition. There's some of the stuff, like you said, and like the letter writer said, you're not going to be able to do anything with, and you have to, do the other things that Mike's talking about, and try and give yourself and your assembly the best case scenario that you can. And oftentimes I've seen people, they have a certain amount of money set aside for a project like this, and then they go talk to a contractor who starts telling them about work outside the house that they have to do and putting in ground gutters, and they kind of scratch their head and think, well, I don't have the budget for that. But that's such an important part to the long-term survival of the finished basement project, that you have to incorporate that into the same scope of work.
Any ideas on what you might do at that mud sill area and the top of the foundation to make it more dryable, and not, spray foam it in with some closed cell spray foam where any moisture isn't going to be able to come inside. It might be able to move outside, but then might end up causing some rot occurring in there.
I think it's a risk, and I think if you're going to do that, you better put some hobo data loggers in there to at least keep track of what the moisture content, so you can then pull it off if you need to, or make other provisions for drying, right? We can make changes and then monitor them to see if it's good practice, or we can leave it alone, would be the other thing I might suggest.
And that's a great spot to use mineral wool as an insulation. It's not always the right insulation to use for things, but that's a really good spot for that product.
So for this case, we'd bring the foam insulation up the surface of the foundation concrete wall or block wall on the inside up to the top of the foundation, seal it to the foundation, maybe cut and cobble some foam to the rim joist area, and then over the top of the foundation, and then the mud sill portion inboard of where you've put in maybe a 1 or a 2-inch panel of rigid foam cut and cobbled in, put the mineral wool on top of that, figuring that the joist bays, even though you may finish the ceiling, the joist bays themselves are still going to be open to some airflow, which is going to be conducted also to the floor above and the ceiling. So any moisture vapor that is, or moisture that's wicking into the mud sill, will be able to go through that mineral wool and then kind of find its way by vapor diffusion through the drywall ceiling or through the floor above.
Yeah, and what you described is exactly what I did in my basement.
It's a great question, Dan. And honestly, how to have an intelligent conversation with a contractor who's coming to talk about any subject, I would say do your homework on finehomebuilding.com, honestly. And you can tell pretty quickly if someone is knowledgeable about building science and proper ways to fix things by pretty quickly, I think, if you do your own research.
And that's a litmus test when you're talking to a contractor, is if they're telling you, oh, we just put poly against the wall, then we put some fiberglass insulation, then we leave a 4-inch airspace because you want the air to flow. And then, you start hearing things like that, then you got to go, okay, this may not be the right fit for me.
I would be thinking, how much do I have to pay you to leave me alone right now? Yeah. Oh, this is another good question. This is the other Ben from Columbus, Ohio. Hey, podcast crew, what books or resources would you recommend for historical preservation techniques for early 1800s to 1900s era structures? Historical preservation techniques are often mentioned in passing on the podcast, and I'm sure many listeners would love to know if Taunton has a specific book regarding the subject, or if Taunton will be publishing one in the near future. Thanks for all of your insights and discussions. It's great to have Kylie back regularly. Kylie's work with GBA was the tipping point that got my girlfriend interested into listening to the podcast. Apparently, you have to listen to FHB. I'm not the only one with snakes in my ceiling. Wasn't convincing enough. But Kylie's interest in sustainable building practice and tiny homes won my significant other over. Thanks for saving my relationship. With regard to pest control, the following YouTube channel has been a huge help in dealing with pests in my house. Guy's Pest Solutions. Guy Amato did return the email I wrote and provided generous assistance. He might be a fun resource for an interview on pest control. Thanks to you, as always. What do you think, Ian? Get Guy Amato on for a pro talk?
Yeah, I'll have to reach out to him. I like talking pest control with people. I've lived in enough older homes, and even growing up on the farm, pest control was a very important topic.
So you may know I watch a Midwestern or a couple Midwestern auto mechanics on YouTube. Certain times of the year, they are overrun with mice. Is that a problem on your parents' farm too?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Mice, and even in my garage, you have to watch out. We get them in that I don't know, October, November, when it starts to get cold. They're racing to the inside, and then you've got to wait until they're in there, and you've had the freeze cycle outside, and that's when you can start attacking it with pest control. That
sounds just awful.
I can tell some real horror stories, but I don't know if this is quite the rated podcast for my rat stories from my childhood.
Another after show topic.
Yeah, that might be a good after show topic.
I'm getting off track here by quite a degree. Historic preservation, carpentry. Who wants to go first?
One of the best books I've read was, I believe it was put out by the Smithsonian or the Department of the Interior, on the work that you should do and should not do to historic buildings. And I think I got turned on to that book either by Mason Lord at Hudson Valley Preservation or by one of the estate managers that I worked for. But I think if you search that book, it's out there, and it talks about loads of different stuff. It's a very thick, small print kind of book with not a lot of pictures in it. It's mostly text and instructions.
Mike, you got thoughts?
Well, my first thought is Brent Hull. He's architectural preservationist, builder, and remodeler, and his both written books, written articles, and he wrote an article for Fine Homebuilding just a few years ago. I don't remember what year it was, and he had his collection of books, which are must-have resources. Now, I haven't gone through and looked at the article recently, but I think there's probably a few books or portions of books that he has on his reading list that deal with preservation. Not necessarily in that specific time period, early 1800s, early 1900s, but it would probably cover, I think historical preservation techniques might be applicable from other generations as well, because the techniques may be, universal in some regard.
Jeff, you knew any good books on the subject?
Not really. I mean, nothing specific. That's not an area I've had to delve into too much.
I know the National Park Service has some great resources on their site on how to deal with historic structures, because obviously they have to, and they don't want to mess up our nation's most important buildings. So their resources are fantastic, and I don't know. That's a tough nut to crack. Maybe our listeners will weigh in with other things to guide folks who are interested in building or working on old homes.
One of the best pieces of advice I got as a young carpenter working on older buildings was to think about the next tradesperson who's going to have to remodel that structure in 15 years or repair something in a couple of decades. Can they systematically undo or take apart the work that you've done? So staying away from things like spray foam or other difficult mechanical fasteners that are not easy to take apart. Don't slap things together with construction adhesive. Think through how something's going to have to get taken apart later.
Wrapping something with ice and water shield seems like a risky strategy, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I hope listeners will weigh in more on this subject, but I think it's super interesting. I bought a cool book at a national park when I was in my 20s, and I can't remember which park it was, but it was called Woodworking and Home Building in Colonial America, and it was like a well-illustrated, reasonably thick book that showed physically how to build a house in colonial times using traditional methods and the tools. Now, I'm not sure that you would want to do that today using traditional tools because it would be backbreaking, but it shows you how houses go together, and I'll put a link to that book. I think it's still in print, so it was pretty good. Have you guys worked on houses of this vintage? It's totally different and more difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also taught. Go ahead, Mike.
Especially the old plaster. Everything you touch and the plaster just crumbles off the wall. So if you don't want it to come off the wall, you have to be so careful.
I worked on a few older homes when I lived in the Northeast, and I think I worked in the oldest still standing house in Woodstock, New York, which dated from the early 1700s, I think maybe 1730s or 40s. And I worked on a couple of 1700s homes with Mason Lord at Hudson Valley Preservation, and the thing that jumps out to me is how little structure there is in some of these old timber frame buildings that's holding them up.
And somehow they're still standing, right? That's
yeah. You think about all the things that modern building codes make you do, and then you open up the wall of a old timber frame and it's like there's no studs for like 8 feet. You've just got some timber frame post and beam. That's it.
What struck me about working on houses of that era was how much more difficult it was to make exterior penetrations for a sillcock or a light fixture or, I don't know, even a new opening. It's just like, oh my gosh, everything is so thick and hard to get through. And, you're talking about chestnut board sheathing. It's just hard work. Drilling, into a corner board for oh god. Yeah, you think it's going to be an inch or two thick, and it's 6, 8, 10 inches of drilling and more drilling through hardwoods. It's great.
And getting extensions for drill bits and putting extensions on extensions, wondering when it will end.
And they're like, you don't want to cook the bit immediately, but it's, at a point you're just like, well, I just have to get this done. And yeah, it's going to cost a drill bit, but there we go. Trevor has a question to the podcast about a subject that I'm looking forward to diving into, because it's something that Martin describes certain building science conversations as playing whack-a-mole. You think you get the information out there, but you don't, and the same conversation keeps occurring. So I think this is one of those situations here. Trevor writes, "Hey, Patrick and team, I'm considering adding an accessory dwelling unit to my property, and I'm looking at buying a shipping container. Since I live in Portland, Maine, I am particularly concerned with insulation. I want to use as little as possible on the inside so as not to eat into the square footage, but I still want to be warm and toasty. At the same time, I'd rather not use any on the outside for aesthetic reasons. I gather from my initial research that spray foam is probably the best option for this project. Do you concur? Any other suggestions or things to consider in using a shipping container for an ADU? Thanks for considering my question. I know this isn't really fine home building. I love the show and look forward to watching it while I work each Friday." Well, thanks, Trevor. Shipping containers, what do we think about these as a structure? This has gotten a lot of traction over the years, at least in mainstream media, as a very good idea. Do we think this is a good idea? No.
No.
We don't think this is a good idea. No. And why don't we think this is a good idea?
For the most simple way to explain why it's not a great idea is you're overcomplicating the easiest part of a house to build by using a shipping container. The walls and the floor and the roof structure, especially if you come up with a real simple salt box kind of design.
A box, like a shipping container.
Yeah. And the materials outside of a narrow moment in time in 2020, 21, and 22, they're not that expensive to build a good shell of a building. And you've got a lot of different options for setting it on foundation-wise, slab on grade. Most building officials will let you use helical piers now to set a building on.
Concrete piers.
Yeah, we saw what John Beer did at his house for his addition to not use a full foundation. There's so many other ways that you're not doing yourself any favors by doing this shipping container.
Mike?
I regularly get calls from people who think I'm smarter than I am. And this one company, this rep from a person from a company that was trying to start, they were a startup, and their startup idea was, we're going to turn shipping containers into ADUs and pop them in all over the place. So they wanted me to consult, and I said, it's not, you better really do your homework. Obviously, it was someone who didn't know anything about construction and was more in that startup idea, and they latched on to the current media frenzy, or for the past, 6-7 years, about shipping containers. And there probably was a point in time where shipping containers were inexpensive, but even used ones that are not usable for shipping anymore for one reason or another, well, obviously you may not want to use those because they probably have holes in them, or they're cracked welds or something like that. And the prices used to be cheap, but now they're not cheap because the steel prices are so high. They're getting recycled. So anyway, there's those problems. And then getting to the insulation point, that Trevor's asking the question about, just on the insulation, it gets really complicated. You've got a steel box which is going to radiate heat. I mean, steel is a very good conductor of heat, so it wants to let that heat go out. And when the sun's beating on it, that heat wants to come in. And now you've got a completely, essentially a hermetically sealed box, which is welded seams. Moisture isn't going to migrate through the walls like we kind of count on with a wood frame house, where a little moisture moves out, a little moisture moves in. You don't have that problem. So that spray foam on the inside is really going to be important. And then just the headaches of dealing with it. I think you're right on, Ian. It's like the cost of doing a wood frame, which is conventional, is probably going to be cost effective and simpler. It just so happens yesterday I was preparing for a presentation I have to give to my local building officials association in a couple weeks on code changes in the 2021 International Residential Code, which my state is going to be adopting. And there's a new section specifically about using shipping containers. And what it does is it refers to the International Building Code. And it says all shipping containers used for residential construction have to comply with the International Building Code. So I looked over at that section, and there's a brand new section in the 2021 IBC. And I sent you a link to that section, Patrick, this morning, if you want to put it in the show notes. Anybody who's considering these, you're going to want to, you'll be dealing with the IBC. And it gets a little more complicated when you're dealing with the IBC as your foundational code for compliance purposes, as opposed to the IRC, which is more prescriptive. So, yeah.
Can I just say, I started on a rant in a staff meeting the other day about futurists and their ideas about housing. And the problem is they seldom get that the white wood frame shell of a house is the easy part, is the fast part. You could frame a shipping container sized homes with 2x6s or 2x4s and OSB or plywood in a day, and you have a building that's ready for windows and doors. How the heck are you going to easily put windows and doors in a shipping container? The end is freaking open with giant barn doors, and like everything is wrong about it. And most containers are not up to the structural requirements of a residential structure, which I learned later. But just because a shipping container is the right shape or form doesn't mean it's strong enough to be building in. So I don't understand why people are so enamored with this. The only thing I can speculate on is that in the early aughts, when I first started hearing about this, and admittedly, it sounds like a very good idea, shipping containers were littering the landscape. We had such a trade deficit with Asia that these things would just pile up on the West Coast, and you could get them super cheap. And people seemed to like, well, it makes sense. We can live in them, except living in a steel can is harder than it at first appears, right?
And when I was looking at the IBC code, the code is based on which type of shipping container you have. And there were like 15 different types, and each one requires different, because structurally, as you point out, they're a little bit different. And I guess when you start looking down, now all of a sudden you got to know what that old shipping container was, because it's going to direct you on what you can utilize it for and what you can't utilize it for. And then when you get into either high wind or seismic zones, then that throws a whole other wrench into the whole planning for utilizing them. But there are people doing it. And they always
say use it for your storage building, right? It's great for that. Bring it, drop it on the site. You can make a smaller house more affordably if you want to. You know, it's probably not a good house. By probably, I mean never.
So we've killed that. Now can we discuss 3D printed houses? I'm sure that was
yeah, well, go ahead. It's the same problem.
Maybe we save that
right?
for another after show where we can blow that one apart too.
Same problem.
I think to Patrick's point about the futurists, they just can't handle that we cracked the code on how to most efficiently build a house in like the late 1800s, and we're just like, nope, yeah, light wood framed platform framing. Yeah, that's good. We don't need to do any better than that.
Right.
And it kills them to think that, like, where's the innovation? Well, yeah, it was done 200 years ago. We're good.
What bugs me is if the market had to justify things like 3D printed houses from a financial, dollar, like I'm selling to cost to build, but there's billions of dollars of investor money that is there to demonstrate these things. But to my satisfaction, no one has proved that it makes economic sense. It's just something that can be done. Does it really make sense to make housing better or more affordable? I think that remains to be seen.
I'm going to double down on a different angle of the rant here, and I think that people want to throw money at some of these ideas because we are really bad at training other human beings to do things with their hands, and it's much easier to throw giant sums of money at 3D printed houses and shipping container houses instead of just taking people and training them with the same skills that people had in the early 1900s or post-war when they were building tons of homes quickly and efficiently and at a low cost.
I think Habitat for Humanity is an excellent modern model for the very thing you're talking about, Ian. Small, affordable houses built very quickly because they're simple to build. There's no need for giant 3D printers or plasma torches to cut window open. You know what I mean? It's like it's all stuff we know how to do and is easily taught. I need to calm down. It's not good for my shoulder. Trevor, build a ADU out of a stick frame, and if you want to make it this, aspect ratio and size of a shipping container, have at it. But boy, why not? Make it easy on yourself and less costly.
One nice thing about building on site an ADU is a lot of ADUs go in backyards, and you're going to need a crane to pick up and drop even a shipping container in the backyard. And for that cost of hiring the crane for the day and coordinating everything, you probably bought about a third of the materials for a stick built, or you could at least hire a bunch of laborers to haul all the materials into the backyard at much less cost. So
yeah, and you can get plywood and sticks through a gate that's 30 inches wide, right?
Yeah. Oh, we could keep going and going. Let's do a whole after show on debunking all of the different.
Well, so here's a challenge to the listeners out there who may be in favor of this or think it's a good idea. How about demonstration projects? Show us how this makes sense and where it made sense. And I'm totally willing to talk about that. I'd like I said, it seems very attractive at first glance, but then when you dig a little deeper, it's harder to do than you might be led to believe. This comes from Doug. Hey, podcast team. I've followed the podcast for years, and it's always a good mix of info and fun. I've submitted many comments, but this time I have a question. You always joke about the dubious quality of your answers, but I figure you know more than me. You think that's a fair assumption? Our house is slab on grade with a slab hydronic heating system. It's divided into 3 zones. One for the main part of the house, which includes the kitchen, living room, dining, and den. One for the master bedroom and bath, and one for the guest bedroom and bath. In the winter, when we're not expecting company, I normally set the guest room thermostat about 8 degrees lower than the rest of the house. My question is, since all 3 zones are part of the same concrete slab, is the guest room zone stealing heat from the rest of the slab? Is it a false economy to lower the guest thermostat? Oh, this is such a good question. It is such a good question. Oh, who has an answer?
Yes and yes.
It is. Yes.
Yeah.
Unequivocally.
Wait. What are we answering yes and yes to?
Is it stealing heat from the rest of the slab? Yes. Is it a false economy to keep it lower temperature in that room? Yes.
Oh, boy, I admire your decisive action on this question, but I'm going to say it's a little more nuanced than that. I think it entirely depends on the heat loss of the slab. It could be stealing enough that it's false economy, or it might not be. So
Well,
I
when we
don't know.
talk about stealing heat, does it really matter if it's going into the same building? So, if you got a wall that divides one room to the other, you can air seal the wall and you can put insulation in it, interior that will help to temper the difference in temperature between the two rooms, or I should maintain difference in temperature. But when you got a slab, you're going to get some heat transfer from the warmer rooms to the colder slab, but that is going to taper off the further you get away from that connection of the slab, where one side's warmer and the other isn't. As far as the false economy to lower, from what I understand, you're right, Ian. When you with a radiant floor heating system, you're really not going to gain much benefit by lowering the temperature. There's always water cycling through that slab. It's just going to be injected at a lower temperature. But there again, it depends on
Is
the
that true?
type.
Wait a minute. Before we say that, if this is on a zone valve, there's not necessarily water or antifreeze circulating through that slab. Am I right?
Not in
And I
that
was just
zone.
Yeah.
And I was going to mention that it all depends on the way that hydronic system is set up. Some will just shut down, they turn on and off. Others will always be circulating water through, or glycol through the slab. But what is happening is at the injection point, you're mixing recirculated water coming back, return water, with new water, warmer water, so that it maintains the slab at a temperature which will radiate heat into the room to keep it at the set point. They're very complicated like plot curves for how you set all of these things, and when it's being designed, and it gets in way over my head. I know enough to be dangerous, I guess.
Same here. But we also
Yeah.
know that Patrick is dead against radiant slab heat. So I think that you purposely put this in there so that you could rant negatively about radiant floor heat.
I'm not against radiant floor heat. I am against spending money of my own on radiant floor heat. I think spending someone else's money on it is totally within, my fondness for radiant heat. No, it's nice. It's very comfortable. I would argue that, build a low load house and you don't need radiant heat. But, if you're living in a place with radiant heat and it's normal, then I'm sure it's very comfortable and lovely.
I think the true answer to the second question, is it a false economy to lower the guest thermostat, is really going to be, well, not entirely, but partially dependent on how much of that slab edge is exposed to the exterior of the building. So how much surface area is that losing heat to?
It's a really good point.
And whether or not that's insulated and how well insulated, because where we find, when I found, in the older homes, which were built without any insulation, they put copper pipes in that are still operating, copper pipes in the slab. These were built during the 50s and the 60s, primarily. They didn't put any insulation at the outside edge, and they just, when you put a thermographic camera, IR camera on the outside, it's just like white hot around the perimeter. That's where most of the heat loss is.
The lore is that on Levittown, those houses would start growing spring flowers in February because of the heat loss through the edges of the slab because of the in-floor heating system.
And you never had to shovel snow around the perimeter of your house because it would just melt. It was like a snow melt system around the edges.
That was my point earlier, is I think it depends entirely on the heat loss of that part of the house. And it could, if there's no insulation in the ceiling too, it could be sucking heat from the rest of the house. If there was, you know what I'm saying? It's going to move from more to less. So you're going to be pulling more if there's a bigger heat load in that less conditioned guest bedroom.
So
I think it's a pretty complicated metric. And I think Doug should do some research and report back to us with monitoring his heating bills and the heating degree days. And then we might be able to extrapolate, does it make a difference and how much? Sounds easy, right?
Totally.
Well, I think there's another metric in there too, is how often are you bringing it back up to the operating temperature.
Sure. Yeah, if you were
If
doing
it's
that
every
weekly
2
or
weeks or
yeah.
3 months.
Yep. Especially if you turn it down and it's off all winter or very low all winter, it'll be different than if you have to turn it up. And I think the reason there is you've got a lot of BTUs that have to go into that slab to raise the temperature. It's not going to happen in a heartbeat. It's going to take several days, and you may end up spending all of the energy that you thought you were saving by keeping the temperature lower just to bring that temperature slab up and let it radiate to bring the air temperature up. It's
I think
complicated.
the final deciding factor on whether to, keep the guest room lower than the rest of the house is the kind of guests you have. Do you want them to be comfortable, or do you want them to move along,
Leave
in a day or
quickly.
two because they're freezing? So what's our podcast after show today, guys? You want to remind listeners?
Talk about the FHB house program and the feature houses that Mike has done, that I did, and John Beer is doing, where we visited yesterday.
And they're all good houses, but all very different. I think you would agree. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I hope you all stay tuned for that. And if you are a Fine Homebuilding All Access member, thank you very much for that. It helps us do the important work of Fine Homebuilding. And if you're not an All Access member, I hope you would consider joining, because not only does it help us keep the lights on, it it presents a number of useful tools for your own building projects and your business. So I hope you'll consider joining Fine Homebuilding All Access to have our archive available and to have access to all of the cool things and videos and podcasts that Fine Homebuilding does, including the podcast after show, which I hope you'll stay tuned and listen into that. Thanks very much, everybody. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Mike, Ian, Jeff, thanks for joining me. Thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Ian, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I can hear you in there.